and we've been doing this as a collaboration between our law firm and the church, with Reverend Bailey and Sheila O'Rourke and Danielle Brown, and we've been developing this series to look at the history of slavery and discrimination in the country, with the goal of just helping people understand and learn about our history. Part of that process has made us realize that there would be a chance for people to dialogue in a small group. So we thought it would be good to have this opportunity, and we'll talk a little bit about that and have some folks share how we're going to do that. And before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, because some of you may not know, but today is an unfortunate date. 5 years ago, there was a shooting in the Emmanuel Bethel AME Church. And Reverend Bailey, do you want to just provide a little context and remembrance before we get started?
It's actually Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is one of our first churches that was started in the South during the 1800s, and was one of the churches that was closed, as many of the African churches were closed pre-Civil War, and many of them didn't open until after the Civil War, some even to late 1800s. The Emmanuel Nine were in a prayer meeting, and a young brother walked in. His name just slipped me right now, and walked in and shot all 9 of them during the Bible study. And the reason why it's good to remember today, because most people are not even thinking about this. The 9 people were killed, and it's not something that just happens every once in a while. The African Methodist Church and Black churches, period, have been under attack since they've been started in this country. Either burnt out, people chased out of communities. Right here in Lancaster, the Conestoga Church had a church. We had a church there that was an African Methodist church that was burnt out, burnt down. And I think the saddest thing about the Emmanuel Nine is after they were shot, a police officer took the brother who shot him and stopped off to get a McDonald's.
Right.
That just shows you how cruel and how unfeeling the police officers were at that moment, not understanding that a murderer, a mass murderer, intended to kill people, took them for a hamburger. That in itself says a lot. And it tells us why we have so much, why it's important that we're doing what we're doing tonight, and that you're with us.
One of the things that I found interesting, Reverend Bailey, is that this church was founded in 1816. So if you think back to the seminars we've done before, or the last one when we were looking at the history, of course, that's pre-Civil War, right? So you now have, the time when the slavery system was in full force in this country. And in 1822, one of the church's co-founders was planning a rebellion, a slave rebellion, and apparently the white community found out about it, and they burned the church down and they hung the pastor. And it just is another kind of historical reference that ties to us today. Here is a historic Black church that has endured generations of violence, and it continued up to 5 years ago. And of course, we've just witnessed that it continues today. But it just ties things together. And I think part of the point of all these seminars is for people to understand that the way we are today, how we are, the systems we have in place are all tied together to our history. And that's really important to understand. All right, so the next thing is just an announcement. We are going to have our next big group presentation on July 22nd. It will follow a similar format as the one we had earlier in June. We will be sending out an invitation for that. It'll be through Zoom. This will not be a small group meeting, but this is going to take us through the present day. So we stopped at 1970 with the basically the end of the civil rights movement. If you recall, there was the adoption of the Fair Housing Act, which was the last piece of important legislation during the 1960s to address basically everything that occurred post-Reconstruction that kept Black folks from having equal rights in this country. So we're going to go from 1970 and take it to the present. So hopefully you can join us for that. All right. At this point, I'm going to have Reverend Bailey talk a little bit about the goal and purpose of these small group sessions.
Well, I think it's very clear what we're asking people to do. What we're asking people to do is thinking, really to think. It's the most important thing before we respond. Think and wrestle with the information that's being given to you tonight and the information that was given to you for you to read. The purpose is we really want people to begin doing some self-healing and letting that healing spread to their families and their communities, their societies. Right now, I'm getting together a letter even to churches to ask churches to begin talking about their role in promoting racism by either actively being racist or not being anti-racist. And it's important that we begin thinking about how do we change this. It comes as changing what we think. The last thing I'll say on that, the Bible talks about faith comes by hearing, and hearing is what affects us. So what we've been hearing all of our lives is what we end up believing, even when it's not the truth. So what we have to start doing is we have to change the information that's coming into our heads so we can get new information to refute the old information so we can have faith in what we're doing about becoming anti-racist. So that's what we're hoping people will begin working on from tonight, and we've been trying with these other sessions, is to get those lies out of our head, get facts into our heads that can give us a new information that we can think about. We can form a rational conclusion and things that we need to be able to do about it, become anti-racist.
Thank you, Reverend Bailey. Juji, do you want to talk a little bit about the agenda for tonight?
Sure. And before I do the agenda, since we have 61 people here and we didn't feel like we could do a go around, but I wanted to invite anyone who would like to give your name, go to the chat box, and if you want to put in your name and where you're from, that way we can kind of see who's here. So I'll give you a moment to, can we, oh, we can't do that. Hannah, can you change that? Should we send a message to everyone?
I don't know, Juji, if we were going to open up the chat for
anything. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I missed that when we discussed that. Okay, so you will have the opportunity to do introductions in your small group. So that's when that will happen then. And let me just go over the agenda. We've had an overview. And so Sheila is going to review our guiding principles that we decided on, and Danielle will do kind of an overview of our small group discussion activity. And we'll have about 45 minutes for the small discussion where you'll be in smaller groups. And we have facilitators who will be leading that. And after that, we'll come back for about 25 minutes with a large group discussion to hear back from the groups and a small closing. So that's the agenda, and we can move on to Sheila.
Thanks, Juji, and thank you, Dwight. So on your screen is a list of guiding principles that our small group came up with when we met on January 22nd. The idea behind having guiding principles for our conversation is that talking about race and racism is challenging. And some of us may have more experience talking about it, and some of us may have less. Some of us may have more knowledge and information, and some of us may have less. And that can make people feel uncomfortable or fearful of participating or any other sorts of ways. So the hope is that by coming up together with the way that we want to have these conversations together, that folks can enter the conversation feeling like they can challenge themselves to share and to really engage with this topic and with each other. So what we had come up with, and this list is subject to change, and if you get into your breakout room and you want to add or subtract something, you certainly could. But just as a baseline for all of us, the principles we came up with were to be brave, be honest, listen deeply with both your head and your heart, try not to take offense, be willing to be uncomfortable, listen to others and don't interrupt, be respectful, practice compassion. If something is spoken out into the room, it can be managed. So rather than sitting in silence, speak out and trust that the group will help you manage whatever comes up. It's okay not to know. We should seek to be curious. Have an open heart to learning. The ouch means that if somebody in your group said something that just doesn't land with you in a way that feels right, you can simply say ouch. You don't need to explain it. There may be the opportunity to go back and address it, but it's just a way that if somebody says something and you want to acknowledge that it's just not sitting with you quite right, that's a tool you can use. Be vulnerable. If somebody shares something that is personal to them, keep it confidential amongst the small group unless there is consent to share it, and be gracious.
Can I say one thing about the ouch? The ouch also could be something that hits you, that you realize you've done something that the ouch makes you say ouch. For example, if I'm preaching on adultery in the church and somebody says ouch because they're committing adultery, and that's okay, that's a healthy thing. Feel that ouch, to recognize, well, I've done that, and I need to make sure I don't do that again. It's good to have that as well. The last thing I'll say on that, this is a privileged statement that African Americans don't have the opportunity to get tired of talking about this, tired of being involved with this. It's something we got to deal with 24/7. And most of the things, we got to be brave, we got to be honest, we got to be willing to be uncomfortable, all those things we go through. And so we're not asking anybody to do something that's out of the ordinary, especially for African Americans.
Danielle, do you want to go over a little bit of the small groups and the breakouts?
Yeah, so when we break out into groups, we're probably, it looks like maybe in groups of 5 to 7, I'm thinking. And so we're going to go through 4 questions. The 4 questions are, as stated earlier, designed to get us to kind of interrogate or wrestle with our thinking and maybe challenge our own selves in the process. We'll go through that. While we're going through that, it's going to be an ask of someone to write down some key thoughts that are coming out of the group. But be mindful that even if you choose to be a scribe, we're still going to ask you to engage in a conversation. We just don't want to scribe to just write. We need everyone's presence. It's also important that if you're able to turn your video on, that your video is on. One of the things that, Zoom allows us, right, to be in this place of connection. So there's so many people. But without video, we block intimacy. And that's really when we start to get into some deep conversation. So if you're able to do that, please do that. And then the size of the group, probably 5 to 7, everyone possibly would be able to unmute their mic. And that may be easier for communication. Usually in these large groups, you can't unmute because it's too much feedback. But when you get into the smaller groups, you may be able to do that, which makes the conversation flow a little bit better. but the scribe is going to be asked to just be able to report out after we come back, maybe just a minute of sharing of key takeaways. And so before you wrap your group up, one of the good things is just that the scribe could review some of the key points so the group is all in agreement. These are the key things that were taken away, and these are the things we'd like to share out.
Thanks, Danielle. So there's these breakout rooms in Zoom, and our master Zoom technician, Hannah, has been working. So just to kind of summarize, as Hannah's finalizing the groups, the breakout groups, there will be a group leader. We have 9 group leaders. So there will be a group leader. There are 4 prepared questions based on the materials that you were supposed to listen to and read, the Seeing White podcast and the 1619 magazine article. So they'll be based on those materials. You'll have 45 minutes, and then Hannah will bring us all back. So we don't need to do anything to leave our groups. And Hannah, are we ready? And anything else you want to add?
No, I don't think so. As soon as I open up the breakout rooms, there will be a pop-up on your screen asking you to join. Just go ahead and click that, and that will automatically take you to your specific breakout room. And then, like Dwight said, I'll give you guys reminders so you're aware of the time, and then you don't have to worry about coming back into the main room. It will just switch back when it's time. So Dwight, if there's nothing else, you let me know when you'd like me to flip the switch.
I think Reverend Bailey is sharing his screen already. That's okay. He just jumped the gun, but let's go ahead and break out to our rooms.
All right.
Are we all back in the main room? I only see myself and the host.
Yes, we should all be back.
And I believe that Hannah is the person I was looking at. You are Dwight. Hi, I'm Melanie.
Hi, Melanie. I know sometimes with the speaker view, you can turn on gallery view. That helps.
You know, I found that I'm on an iPhone right now, an iPhone 10, and that has a slightly different screen than like if I'm on the Google Chromebook.
Oh, right.
It doesn't have all the same features. And then I'm also like sitting there like poking the phone. So I'm gonna keep it like
We
that.
can see and hear you, so that's great.
I was in breakout room 6 with Joan Wright.
Okay, well, we're gonna, Hannah, are we all back together?
We are.
Wonderful. So I think at this point, Sheila and Reverend Bailey and Danielle, we are going to have each scribe from the different breakout rooms share for maybe a minute to a minute and a half what their key takeaway were from the group. And then after we go through each group, we will have an opportunity for some larger group sharing. So I'll start with my group. Katie, I think, is going to report out. So Katie, do you want to do that?
Sure, happy to. So we had some really good dialogue and conversation. I'm just trying to summarize some of my notes here. Some of the highlights being sometimes we don't want to focus on the difficult conversations, because if you focus on the individual, you don't have to change yourself. Or if you focus on the individual, you have to change yourself. Versus if you focus on the other, you can blame and things like that. So it takes a much more candid conversation to do the inner work on education and things like that. So that was part of it. The systemic is our culture that we don't even realize it. Which help.
Well, I mean, we talked a lot about the question from the all men are created equal, and both I think someone put it really well when they said it really isn't the problem of the creation of that concept. I mean, I think we all agree and change the men to a more inclusive term and remove all the qualifiers that were really there in history and aren't written down. But no, we don't have problems with the idea that we are all created equal. It's more recognizing that the treatment is not all equal. And, we can kind of keep this narrative going that, hey, it's written in our founding documents and we have all these rights guaranteed and, our laws are getting updated and that's the battle. And that I feel like we've won that. And the idea that the opportunity isn't really that equal and the treatment isn't that equal is where the problem still lies. So I think that was some of the highlights. I know we're supposed to keep it to kind of 60 seconds because we have a lot of different groups. So we'll give the floor up.
Yeah.
Thanks, Katie and Charlie. Reverend Bailey, do you want to go with your group?
Sister Jeannie's going to report for us.
Okay, some highlights from our group were the idea that systemic racism is measurable while bigotry is anecdotal. And the fact that in systemic or structural racism, it can run by itself. So a person in that system doesn't even recognize what they're doing or may be as liberal as you want, but you're still within that system and it keeps going. We talked about schools teaching history, focusing on the Gettysburg Address, don't tell. Any people don't learn about slavery, and that when you talk about revisionist history, it's labeled as a liberal agenda, as if you are erasing history. We talked about systemic racism and where we see it in institutions, and we often see it in leadership search committees. The code words that are used are that person is not a good fit, or organizational culture is a reason for not having Black people represented, or also to not question why we don't know more people that we could be asking. And the point that systemic racism was put in place specifically against African Americans, and that systemic racism is different for Black people than it is for Hispanic people or Asian people. It is something very specific and something very different.
Excellent, thank you. Sheila?
That was a hard one to follow, so.
Thank you. So from our group, we have Kevin King reporting.
Thank you. Yeah, we talked about what story do the schools and our cultures continue to purport? We can often say, well, that was hundreds of years ago. The Black folks ought to be grateful. Look at the athletes. Look at all the money they're making. Or we've had a Black president. But how often can we talk about how many generations back did my ancestors have slavery? So we look at the outside, but we don't look inwardly about our own generations and say, how have we been part of this system? Back to the all men are created equal. Yeah, it was talked about in our group how it's an aspiration, but certainly not experienced by all. We talked about an example of a systemic racial issue is that used a personal experience with Mennonite Disaster Service in May of 2011. The floods in the Mississippi were overflowing, and so the Army Corps of Engineers had to blow up the levees to release some of the water to protect the large community, primarily white community of Cairo, Illinois. They blew up Pinhook, Missouri, flooding 20 families, giving them 4 hours notice. This happened 9 years ago. And so it's still going on. It's still going on.
Thanks, Kevin. Danielle?
That would be Ryan.
We talked comparing systemic to individual racism, we talked about how it's important to address the systemic racism because it's so much more broad. You know, even though individual instances can be very painful and still important to address, it's important to get at that root cause. We talked a little bit about specific instances that we've experienced of systemic racism, and this ranged from staffing and hiring to racialized poverty to voting in elections, and you know, whether who's got the lines to get in to vote and who doesn't. We talked about the all men are created equal, and sort of how that was taught from one side. And one thing that was brought up that really struck me was that it's African American culture is to tell a story as a group, whereas our history seems to have been sort of anything but that. So very one-sided. So we haven't really gotten the entire story or an accurate story. We talked about how history, you know, racism and slavery is taught in our schools as just a blemish. It's sort of easy to fix, or one person in our group said that it's even taught that it's been fixed, which is pretty striking. We compared Black oppression versus white privilege, how they relate, how they're different. And that led to the fact that if something's uncomfortable to talk about, that means there's something worth talking about. There's something there. And then lastly, we talked about sort of what is whiteness and how does that affect things from, you know, a far-reaching, you know, to I guess to, you know, further this systemic racism. And one thing that really got to me was golfing. We talked about golfing, how that's historically a white sport, and that's historically where a lot of business is done. That's where deals are made, and that's just an environment that Black people were totally excluded from.
Can I just say on that last part, that's not necessarily true. We have been a part of the golfing, but we were always the caddies until they started paying good money. And once the money started being paid good, now you don't see any Black caddies. But we were the caddies. We were the golf ball. Boys ran after the golf balls. But when it became money, became more money, now we're not, you hardly see us. Tiger Woods seems like he's brand new.
Rev, don't sweat our group.
Don't sweat them, no.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Lynn. You out there, Lynn? Do we know who Lynn? Lynn, you gotta unmute.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was muted. Yeah, Teresa Kircher is our scribe.
So,
sorry.
To be clear, before I start my clock, am I covering everything we talked about?
You can give whatever summary you feel is the most important.
This is quite a task. I have 7 pages, but okay.
That's great.
Wow.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I feel bad because I'm picking out things from the notes. But, you know, we talked about, obviously we agree with a lot of what people said about the structural and systemic racism being the root, but someone in our group mentioned the fact that those systems were created by individuals and their own beliefs and practices. And so it's sort of this, yeah, we know the system is bigger, but the system's made up of the individuals. We talked about how oppression really bred racism. And another good point that was made was it's easy to sidestep responsibility when we look at individual racism to say, oh, that's not me. And so that's why it is more important that, you know, we all take ownership in changing the system. Yeah, the all men are created equal was a fun conversation. We just talked about that. Obviously, when that was written, the intention behind that was not to include
Black men or women at all. Even at the time, Black men were considered 3/5 of a man. It was said in our group that that has not gone away, 3/5 of a man, and all of the deaths, even in the last 30 days, just exemplify that. And so even though that statement is ideological and it, we'd love for it to be true now, and it is something that a lot of Black Americans, we learned from the article, they took it literally, and they've continued to aspire for it to be true. We talked about whitewashed history lessons and how changing the education system would change the narrative, how powerful that would be. Oh, this was some good conversation in this one too, that, for 250 years, America prospered and Black people never had the access to that wealth. And we talked about that wealth and power has really propelled all of the systems and the racism all these years. That whiteness was created to cause this division. It wasn't something that was even there. And we didn't get to completely finish number 4.
Thanks, Teresa. Excellent summary.
Can I just say one thing? Again, 3/5 of a man was a political statement, and actually it was was actually adding to Black people, because Black people were not seen as human at all. That statement was made. It was only made a political statement for the voting representatives, rather. But Black people were not seen as human beings, and theologically, many of the theologians declared that we were different people and God created us at a different time.
Well, not even the theologians. The United States Supreme Court in Dred Scott, the worst decision ever issued by the United States Supreme Court, declared that Blacks were not citizens and they were an inferior race. This is the United States Supreme Court. So,
right. And that still was
an yeah.
That still was an improvement, because at least we were an inferior race, but we were human. Before that, yeah. So we were thought not to be human, and so I said that.
All right, Bonnie.
Well, I'm feeling for you, Pam, since a lot of what we discussed has already been mentioned, but Pam is going to report for us.
Pam's muted.
There. Okay, I'm not muted anymore. Yes, a lot of what we talked about has already been talked about, but I will say we spent quite a bit of time on the first question about what is systemic or structural racism versus bigotry, and we talked about how it was laws and policies and regulations that were intentionally to promote one group or another, or to segregate one group from another. And the bigotry would be the individual acting with regard to another individual, such as structural would be real estate redlining, and the bigotry might be the unspoken habit that if a person of color was walking down the street, they would have to move over to let the white person pass by. I like the example of it's the water, not the shark, meaning the shark is the individual bigotry that might raise its ugly head, but the water all around us was poisoned with these laws and policies and regulations which governed behavior. With regard to all men are created equal, we all said, well, that was never carried out. It was not intended by the authors of the Declaration of Independence. And that perhaps some of the signers were not like Thomas Jefferson, but really maybe had in mind the aspiration that all men are created equal, and we could create a society in that way. The example was perhaps John Adams. We need to read our history. With regard to question 3, we talked about examples of the history books and how they don't cover everything. They sort of, forgive the term, whitewash things and do not tell us the bloody truth. They prevent people from seeing and accepting that our country was built on racism, and that it would be, individual would say they are kind to all people, but then they're furious if they might be considered racist because they don't understand the history correctly with regard to how racism has been throughout our history of this country. And we didn't get to question 4.
Thank you, Pam. All right, 2 more groups. Joan?
All right. Melanie is going to represent our group. Please share whatever you would like to share.
Thank you, Joan. So this is much more dynamic than I was expecting, and I'm actually really grateful for the challenge, especially scribing after hearing all those other groups. We got through questions 1, 2, and 3 with most of our time really spent on 1 and 2. We had just started to go into question 3. So I'm going to say we are blessed to have Rebecca in the group, who's from Nigeria and has a PhD, which I think added a little bit of a dimension to the dialogue that was important, at least for me, because the light that she added there was incredibly bright for me. With that, we opened up the discussion point on how how do we say this correct? Chinjira Kumanjaka hopes the seeing white Jinjiraya
Kumanika.
Jinjiraya Kumanika hopes the Seeing White project will focus on systemic and structural racism, not individual bigotry or race relations. But with that, we discussed redlining issues and disparities in loans and real estate. I was hoping to add gerrymandering with voting to that, though the discussion had moved on before we could go there. Disparities in health and the laws surrounding healthcare. We discussed historic elements of disparity, such as if an unwed mother of color was giving birth, how the state would own or take the role of guardian of the child, since there was not a formal husband in place, whereas in white families that might not be the same situation. Spoke about the educational disparities. And then we were challenged, I think, in finding the correct words to truly define individual racism. And once we started speaking about privilege and entitlement and bigotry, more of a narrative formed. Rebecca offered that one of the people in her family had to confirm his professional status as a surgeon because he was of color. We also discussed other examples, such as one person shared, I believe it was Kathleen, that when she was at the supermarket when she was younger, people would put the change down on the counter without ever touching her hand in a basic transaction of just giving change back from a bill. Until we actually can have people share those examples, we can't necessarily feel the tangible elements of what words such as privilege and entitlement and bigotry mean. For question number 2, that's where we really spent a lot of time talking about why everybody felt that no, we do not feel that all men are created equal. We know that we are taught that and we hear it. And everybody said no, but it was very difficult to actually have the conversation emerge and become three-dimensional with why people felt that. And I thought that was a really interesting point, that there was a challenge to really put in words why. And with that, we also spoke about the romanticism of the Constitution's words and what it means to be able to have people moved by their feeling without necessarily knowing what there is in the substance. So we really discuss more that there is no inclusion of women, that once you read the Constitution, that, you know, Black men were not considered whole men, that, you know, the people who were benefiting from that were a very limited part of society. And with that, that there is a romanticism of the content of those words that need to be put more into clarity through education. As we began to speak about what could improve the narrative, with that, there was the continued discussion that there's a romanticism that leads to almost a propaganda, and that to sit down and actually have a real discussion is very challenging. And one of the important questions that was asked is truly what the Civil War was about, and what the Confederacy meant, and what was lost to part of society with that evolution. We started to talk about the Lyndon Johnson era of changes, and that is when we were given the time clock that we're going to be coming to an end. And one of the final points that came up during that time is that for all that, I believe everybody has a love of God, that at times when there are disparities, that religion can be used as a type of a panacea to kind of cover the ugly truth of what is, and to truly get in there and be able to discuss it is hard. To be able to put into words that everybody can understand and share as a collective narrative, it takes courage, and it takes patience, and it takes trust in the people that you are speaking with. And I hope that I did justice to our group discussion.
Thank you, Melanie. You did a great job. The last group is Rebecca's group.
And that's Ethan.
Yes, I'll be representing group 5 today. So on the first question, we talked about individual racism as kind of a heart issue of someone who hates someone else or does something wrong towards someone else solely on the basis of the color of their skin. And we talked about systemic racism as more of a big, as more of a community-wide thing, with things such as redlining. It affects policy, voter suppression. And one thing that stuck out to me is I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and redlining and voter suppression still affect Atlanta today, which is just a very sad reality. And on question 2, we had talked about how all men are created equal, and how someone in our group said for an awfully long time, it took an awfully long time for women to be created equal, incidentally. And similarly with people who didn't have white skin, and just how that phrase was very hypocritical because it was said by white male property owners when that phrase didn't apply to everyone who lived in America during that time. And then when we got to question 3, we just talked about how it took us hundreds of years to get an African American museum in the Smithsonian, and it took so much longer than it should have. We talked about how America needs to own up and acknowledge the fact that slavery was part of our history instead of trying to sweep it under the rug. And someone had actually mentioned how the Germans have tried very much so to own up to the Holocaust by creating memorials and museums and acknowledging that it happened. And another thing we talked about was just how education needs change from the ground level up, just to be more honest and not to romanticize or just to brush under the rug some things that have happened. And on question 4, we were talking about whiteness, and Mr. Dolly, you said something, you started to say something that we shouldn't use terms of not white and black, but talking more just about human beings. And you got cut off by our timer, so if you wanted to share more about that, I would love to let you share that. Oh, you're muted right now.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is that it's not really about white and black, because even though colors are identification, but it is just about a particular group of people decided to look down upon particular set of group of people, either because they are very poor or uneducated according to them, or not equal to them, because this happens even in Africa, because there are some tribes that are being looked down upon and maltreated in a different way than the other tribes. So it is not about color, really, it is about Africans were seen as actually presented even in books that these are subhuman beings who do not know their left and right, immature. Even the language, developed country or underdeveloped country, is just a language of that they are not really developed like a human being, so they cannot be treated like a human being. So it is not really about color. Color just happened to be this particular group of people happen to have a particular color, so it's easy to see them through that color, but it is more of a education, economy. Basically, if you are very poor, less educated, then you will be put down. That's what I was trying to say, not color.
Mr. Dolly, that is true, but here in America, it is color. And it is color in America, which in Africa, do the same thing in Europe. But there's a whole practice that's been put in place based on color in America. And that's what it is. And so when I say people, that's why I don't use the term people of color. Because most people of color, even if they're African, Chinese, whatever, do not feel what the African American feels. Because systemic racism was put in place for African Americans, those who generationally have been here, and that it's based on color. And they had a whole system of it that it was based on. So you're right, in Africa, people have squabbles. In Germany, people have squabbles. And sometimes it's between economics. But in America, it's a race problem. Even though race is not a real thing, it's about race. So I don't say, that's why Africans can come here and do much better than African Americans, because you're right, it's not against them. It's against African Americans. And it systemically continues to push against African Americans, so much so that other people of color, when they come here, they believe it's not about color because their color is to stop. Because it's not against you as an African from Africa. It's not against the Chinese from China. It's against people who were born and raised here, who are children of the enslaved Africans who were brought to this nation. And that's why it's so devious, because even the people who come here, they think it's, well, there's something wrong with those black people who are already here. And they side against the African Americans who are here, even when they're from Africa. They're taught that those African Americans are lazy, they don't know how to take care of their families, and they're poor. We're not poor people. We'd be one of the 7th largest nations in the world economically, just from the African Americans in this country. So systemic racism doesn't affect you, doesn't hit you, but it hits me and my children based on our color and the fact that we've been here. And that's why it's so difficult to get rid of and fight against, because every time we get ready to talk about racism, a whole nother group comes in. And that group comes in and they say, see, they're able to open up businesses. They're able to do this here. So black people can't do it because black people are lazy, or they don't save their money, they don't raise their children, all those lies that have been told. And so that's why we're doing this. I'll finish on this, Brother Dwight. The reason why there's not a lot of African Americans here tonight, you look around at pictures, is because there's another thing that's coming out. White people are saying, we need to listen. What they're saying is the burden is on black people to explain why racism exists. And it's not my burden. That's white folks' burden. They begin explaining to themselves, talking to themselves, why does racism still exist in America, and why aren't more white people anti-racist and not supporting the system. And so it is color. And maybe it doesn't hit you, but it hits me. And it's hit me my whole 70 years in America.
And I just want to add to that, Rev, because that was an ouch for me also. You know, there's a simulation they have, and I'll try to find it, but my child, my African-American child right now, coming from middle-class home, because he's African-American, has a greater chance of living in poverty because of the systems that are in place than he does living in the middle class. So even if we're talking about the concept of now, you know, like you said, Rev, those poor people can't, my child has a greater chance of going to jail, being killed, living in poverty because he's an African-American male, because of the policies, the racist policy systems and structures that are in place in this country because of color. And the wealth gap, and I put that in the chat to share, but I'll share the wealth gap right now in the United States for a white family is about 10 times greater than that of a Black family. That's the gap that's been created.
Excuse me, and I just wanted to add, and that's the reason why I would believe your son had to prove he was that surgeon in order for that person to drive him, because they didn't look at him, they looked at him as Black, period. Not African, not African American. Well, African American, they looked at him, they saw him as a Black man and made a decision about what his worth was and who he could be based upon the color of his skin without him even speaking. So color does matter, and it does make a difference.
Let me just add one thing too, speaking from a white man's perspective. White people like to talk about reconciliation. We need to reconcile with Black folks. And when you understand the history of our country, I think we as white people need to understand how offensive that is. It makes it seem like there was a separation between white and Black people and we both need to kind of come back together. Do you understand how just wrong that is? White folks enslaved Africans 400 years ago. And then we systematically, through the foundation, the Constitution, court rulings, laws, police, every system that you could think of, we used to hurt Black people. And so for us to now come 400 years after 1619, which is when the first enslaved Africans arrived here, and say, you know, we need to reconcile, to me, really misses the point. White people need to reckon with our past, and we need to understand what we do with that. But to suggest that Black folks somehow need to now kind of do their part, a little bit like Reverend Bailey said, like they need to educate us, white folks, on what we did to their ancestors, is kind of perpetuating the same stuff that we're trying to get out of. So if you're white, you need to own up to this. Like, this isn't something you need a Black brother to tell you about, right? That's kind of ridiculous. And I think for us, when we have opportunities, we shouldn't turn to a Black brother or sister and say, well, tell us about this. Because we're doing kind of the same thing. We need to know about it. And if we don't know about it, we need to figure it out. And we need to take ownership. We need to take the lead. We need to take responsibility for what has happened and what is going on in our country. This notion of reconciliation, as you can tell, kind of rubs me the wrong way, because it's a way for us to avoid our responsibility. And yeah, so I'll just, stop there.
And that's why we're asking people to read the material. And you need to really read the material that we are asking you to read, so you can discuss it and familiarize yourself with it. So when we come back and talk about it, you're not just getting the information from African American or the person that's in
Yeah.
the group, getting the information from the people. We're getting the information, all getting the same information, and we're discussing the same source. That helps. So if you can do that, make sure you read it and do the homework. It helps us in our conversation.
But may I share?
Yeah, just let me just say one thing. We're going to end in 12 minutes. So we want to, we've gone over, and if it's okay with everybody, we'll go 12 more minutes and we'll ask for some additional sharing, but then we're going to cut it off at 8 just to be respectful of everybody's time. Go ahead.
May I share a different school of thought that's been shared with me?
Sure.
In that, I hope I can explain it correctly, but the example is, if you are a woman, is it possible for a man to take the responsibility of being a feminist activist? And my answer to that is probably not, because they can't put themselves in the shoes of a woman. And so there's an author right now, her name's Glennon Doyle. She wrote a very famous book. And so she talks about racism. And the way she presents it is that Black individuals have had to live with this for centuries. And so it's in their DNA, passed on generation to generation. And for white people to assume that responsibility, is that now, she poses it, now I am a racist because they've already tried to walk and talk that walk and talk. And now we're coming in saying, but we can fix it. So is that not racism in itself?
It's not fixing them.
That's not racism.
It's fixing us, not fixing them. Okay?
So I guess fixing the system, the whole
fixing our system.
Racist system. What am I supposed to do? Like, I can educate myself, I can, but what else can I do to help fix the system?
Well, the first thing is not to think you're helping the system. First thing you have to see is you're helping yourself. Because when you become an anti-racist, you get rid of a lot of bad things that are on the inside of you. So it's self-interest, number one. Number two, that lady, whoever said that to you, she was
Glennon Doyle, yeah.
She's behind backwards, in my mind. I am a husband, has a wife. I don't have to walk in her shoes to understand how to treat her. So I've had to change the way I thought a woman should be treated.
Okay.
Matter of fact, she made sure I did that. I'll give you a good example. Other women I could take to McDonald's. When I met her, she said, I can buy McDonald's for myself. So I had to quickly learn how to adjust to her. And that's what white people can do. Don't put it on me. Stop and think, is this how I would want to be treated? And the best thing to do is to say to people, do to others as you would have them do for you. And you'd be surprised at how much that will change your mindset. You just think like that.
And the other thing that I might would say is, if you really engage this material and just kind of sit with it and just think about like sessions 1, 2, 3, and 4, and read that 1619 project, and just really sit with that and take that in. Because for me, knowing a lot of this and listening and reading, it was overwhelming. It just, I texted Danielle last night, I texted Becky, and I said, it's too much. And so I think one of the things to really, before I want to try to fix anything else or do anything else, I really need to learn. Because as we said, history has been romanticized and whitewashed, and a lot of people haven't truly learned the true story. And so really taking that time to learn and sit with it, that would be a good first step. That would be a really good first step. Before I do anything else, I need to really get this and sit with it and understand it, and then move from there.
And just to tack onto what Joan was saying, there's more Seeing White episodes. We just had you listen to the first 4, but you probably noticed that I think it goes to 11. And there's another series from that same person that has recently come out. I think it's series 4 or season 4 that has some episodes on Reconstruction and some other things that are very interesting. So we're going to continue to try and put some of those resources on our website. And we do plan on having additional small group sessions. But I just want to reiterate what Joan said. You know, we can start, an easy thing for each of us to do is to learn about our history, is to really engage it and understand it. And then we're maybe not so surprised or at a loss when we see what happens. When we see a debate about taking down Confederate statutes, I scratch my head and get very angry why those are even around anymore. It makes no sense to me. But until you understand that after the Civil War, we went through Reconstruction, and then there was this effort to romanticize Confederate soldiers. So we put all these statutes up all across the South as a way to keep pushing down Black Americans. And now we're having a debate of whether we should take them down or not. But if you don't understand the history, then you just get to this and somebody says, well, it's about our history and we want to just be sure we maintain them. No, there is a real context into how they got there. But if you don't understand it, you don't get it. It's just more news that just kind of comes in and out. Understand our history. It's all connected.
Can I just share a
or if
quote?
you look at
Can I?
Or if you look at the story of the young guy Isaac Woodard, and then you understand when he came back from the military, when he came back home from the military, and to have the cops beat him in his head to the point that he lost sight, and to know that they were allowed to do that and that they received immunity. They were protected by the law, that they could hurt Black people and be protected. They could have immunity. And today, cops can kill Black people and say they get qualified immunity. It's like not even a different word. Still qualified immunity. You really let that sit with you, that wow, this happened then and they got immunity, and here we are today, and you still are protected by the law. You're still protected by the law of the land, and you get qualified immunity. That's pretty profound.
Can
I let that sit?
Can I share something too? And it made me think about maybe something you were talking about, Susan and Dwight. Something from Ibrahim Kendi's book, when he said, "Fooled by the racist idea, I did not fully realize that the only thing wrong with Black people is that we think something's wrong with Black people. I did not fully realize that the only thing extraordinary about white people is that we think something is extraordinary about white people." And that, I think, gets to the root of, I think, what you were trying to say, Dwight. And maybe I feel like if I read the book, kind of where you were getting at, Susan, too. What white folks can do is unpack the idea, is that the idea that you've been told that there's something extraordinary about you, to the thought of me. And when you unpack that, that's your due. And it's not to say that we all aren't children of God. I mean, I fully believe that. But your blood is red as well. But somehow this country has been made you to think that yours is red with a little bit of gold dust in it, and mine's red with a little bit of dirt. And so when you unpack that concept and you start to sift through that really, and start to really sift through that concept of just what has whiteness done to me, and challenge that, I think that's where You know, I think that's what Dwight was getting at. I can't work that out for you because that's something you got to work out for yourself. You know, that idea of whiteness. And I think where the author from what I'm hearing from you is saying, like, do not approach a Black person in a condescending manner. Like, don't come at me with that mess thinking now all of a sudden you're going to help me and save the world, because now you're just using your whiteness to get on my nerves. I think that's kind of where it was, but it's that idea, like Ibrahim hit it the best, like that idea that we think, our problem is that we think something's extraordinary about white people and there's something wrong with Black people. When we challenge that individually, like me individually, I challenge the fact that I am, you know, one of my elders had said to me, I remember a boyfriend I had, he said to us, you seen as a man among men. And that is one of the most powerful things I've ever heard, you know, him say, and he was a Black man. You seen as a man among men. And I'm saying it in a broader sense of the men word, but that for me, like, that's what I challenge within myself. I see it as a man among men. I don't have to play small in no space. That's my challenge. Your challenge as white folks is to realize you don't have to stand on my back in order to get this. And when you realize you're on my back, get off.
Can I just say, to go with you, Danielle, I think it was Van Jones, I'm not sure, said, racism isn't a Black people problem, it's a white people problem, and white people need to fix it.
That's so true. Brother Bishop has his hand up. Go ahead,
I'm
Brother
sorry.
Bishop. No, go ahead, Brother Bishop. I'll shut up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that to Dwight's issue, yes, we need to solve this problem. This problem has been around for 400 years now, and it's going to take a long time to solve it. And I think that one of the ways that it can be done is to revisit the true history of the United States and what took place. For instance, in Tulsa, and I brought this up in our group discussion, they interviewed young Black people as to what happened in Tulsa during that massacre. And some of those young Black people had no idea that it even took place, and they had lived in Tulsa all their lives. So we need to start from the very young to educate them, to look at our textbooks, our history books, and start somewhere that we can start changing the thought process and let everybody know what took place. I know the Blacks live this, but they don't, some of them don't even know their own history because it hasn't been written in books. They've conveniently avoided it to make this, you know, kind of make everything look great. So we need to do things like education starts at a very young age, but it also can be, these kinds of things can be put on shows and trying to get, you know, a wide audience, and they just have to start doing things like Dwight was, yeah, we need to put out the truth and not to whitewash it, so to speak. So I don't know all the things that could be done, but I think education starting with the very young, and I think our kids these days are more open to it than I can remember in, you know, all through grammar school and high school myself. Something like that has to be done. And I was listening to one thing that according to reparations, they're not looking for money. They're looking for equality and to be recognized as, you know, normal human beings, and to be have equality and throughout all of our society.
Thanks, Doug. I think we're going to try, Reverend Bailey, do you want to have the last word here?
Yeah. We're not asking you folk to fix racism. We're not asking you to fix racism. We're asking you to do what Danielle said. Begin thinking about the problem that you have with race, that you have with Black people. How have you been affected by systemic racism, affected your views? How has it made you respond to people who are Black? What has it made you accept? So we're not trying to fix racism. That's not your job tonight. It won't be your job anyway. We're not that good. What we're asking you to do is to look at the information we're giving you and then think about what changes do you need to make for yourself, and what changes can you make in your family and your community around you. But we're not trying to fix racism here tonight. And part of what you brought up about the Tulsa incidents, that's the problem. The reason why young Blacks don't know about it is because we have a political educational system that makes sure that Black people, including Black people, not only white people don't know about racism, Black people don't know about it. So much so that there are Black people in this community that say, don't go to Reverend Bailey's church because he doesn't like white people. And all I teach is about how I love Black people. And I love all people because I can love Black people. So we're not asking you to fix nothing. Don't get that twisted. Don't run out of here tomorrow, become some avenging saint against racism. Begin thinking about it. Go through the subject matter that we're giving you. Prayerfully look at it and see where you can make a difference in your life, your home, your community. If you do that, then we've succeeded at what we're working at tonight.
Reverend, may I ask if our group, if they have not looked up anything about Juneteenth, that they could look that up right now, I mean, before Friday, and they could look up about the Black Wall Street.
Right.
They, if not to just hear it mentioned on the television or just hear the word mentioned on, and seen in the newspaper, look it up. Actually look it up and read what it's about.
It's called
That's
Black
learning.
Wall Street. Black Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
If you go up under that, you'll see why Tulsa was burnt down.
That's right.
All right, I think we've done a good job tonight.
Thank you all. That was great. We'll see you in July.
Be blessed.
Best and blessed to you all. Thanks for all you're doing.